He pointed a trembling finger. "You, madam, are unfit." The words echoed in the stifling air of the Salvation Creek courtroom, sucked dry of all compassion. The air was thick with unswept dust and the sour smell of judgment. Elara stood alone, a widow with eyes that had seen too much loss and not enough justice. The pine bench behind her was packed with townsfolk, but not one person met her gaze. They stared at the floor, at their hands, at the cracks in the wall, anywhere but at the woman being publicly undone. On his raised platform sat Judge Thorne. He was a man who mistook his authority for wisdom, a small tyrant in a dusty kingdom. He looked down at Elara, not as a citizen, but as an inconvenience. "This court finds," Thorne continued, his voice dripping with a false pious concern, "that the petitioner, Elara," he paused, as if her name tasted foul, "is emotionally compromised. Her visible grief, her clear lack of means, they paint a picture of instability." In the front row, the town banker, Mr. Croft, watched with a subtle cold smile that never reached his eyes. He tapped his fingers silently on the handle of his briefcase. Thorne was leveraging her pain, turning the very act of mourning her husband into a weapon against her. He was ruling on her petition to keep the small mortgaged ranch she and her husband had built from nothing. It was all she had left. It was a pain many knew, to be judged by those who had never walked a mile in her dusty boots, to have their deepest wounds held up as proof of their weakness. The silent spectators knew it. They had all felt the sting of a powerful man's boot, even if they wouldn't admit it. Elara's humiliation was a physical thing, a hot flush that burned her neck and ears. She was a spectacle. She felt the weight of their averted eyes, and it felt heavier than the judge's gavel. Therefore, the petition is denied. The ranch reverts to the bank, to Mr. Croft, as per the outstanding mortgage agreement. "But, Judge," Elara whispered, her voice cracking, "the harvest, I only need—" She opened her mouth to speak, to plead, to fight, but the judge cut her off with 2 words, sharp as a whip crack. "Silence, woman." The gavel struck the desk. The sound wasn't just wood on wood, it was a gunshot, the sound of her life ending. It was the sound of the nail being driven into the coffin of her hope. She had lost her home, and in that stifling, silent room, surrounded by folks she'd known her whole life, she realized she had just lost their respect, too. Elara stood there, numb, shattered, the echo of the gavel still ringing in her ears. The silence of the spectators pressed in on her, heavier than any spoken judgment, as she turned to leave the only world she had ever known. She pushed open the heavy oak doors of the courthouse, and the sound of them closing behind her was one of absolute finality. The harsh afternoon sun struck her immediately, a physical blow that made her flinch. After the dim, suffocating judgment of the courtroom, the blinding light of the main street felt like an interrogation. She was exposed. Her first few steps were unsteady, taken on a boardwalk that suddenly felt foreign. And then the shunning began. She saw Mrs. Gable, the baker's wife, standing outside the mercantile. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second before Mrs. Gable grabbed her young son's arm, turned her back, and hurried inside the store as if Elara's poverty were a contagion. 2 ranchers, men who had shared coffee with her husband just months ago, tipped their hats low and abruptly crossed the dusty street to walk on the other side, their boots kicking up small puffs of judgment. The humiliation was no longer just an echo in her ears. It was a physical weight, a heavy, stifling cloak draped over her shoulders in the blistering heat. It pressed down on her chest, making each breath a shallow, painful task. The judge's word, "unfit," beat against her skull like a drum. Unfit, unfit. What did it mean? Unfit to grieve, unfit to be poor, unfit to be alone. Her hand, deep in the pocket of her worn dress, tightened around a small piece of wood. It was a bird, a meadowlark, carved from scrap pine by her husband's hands just a week before he died. Its edges were smooth, worn down by her constant touch. It was the last thing he ever made her. She gripped it so tightly her knuckles went white, the sharp edge of its wing digging into her palm, the small pain a desperate anchor in a sea of shame. She passed the saloon. Through the bat-wing doors, the familiar drunken notes of a piano stumbled into the street. It was the only sound in town, a tinny, careless melody. As her shadow fell across the threshold, the music stopped. It didn't just fade, it died. Even the drunken piano player, a man lost in his own fog, had stopped, as if her silence was louder than his music. The sudden quiet was deafening. It was the entire town holding its breath, watching the unfit woman walk. She was an outcast. She was invisible to the good people of Salvation Creek. Like many of us, she carried scars no one could see, but today hers had been branded onto her, skin for the whole town to mock. They had watched her be stripped of her home, her name, and her dignity, and they had done nothing. They had let it happen. Defeated, she didn't even know where her feet were taking her. She just knew she couldn't stay. She reached the end of the boardwalk. The blacksmith's forge was cold. Before her, there was only the vast, empty expanse, the dusty trail that led away from Salvation Creek and into the sun-scorched Badlands, a future that held nothing. She stopped, the dust settling around her worn boots. There was nowhere to go. A shadow detached itself from the deep shade of the livery stable. It was a tall, imposing figure, moving with a silent grace that didn't belong to this town. He stepped into the dusty street, blocking her path. It was Silas, the man they called the Ghost of the Red Mesa, an outlaw with a bounty on his head. The town of Salvation Creek froze. It wasn't just a pause. It was a complete cessation of life. The wind stopped blowing dust. The creak of the mercantile sign stopped. Every eye which moments before had so cruelly avoided, Elara was now locked on the man who stood before her. Silas, the Ghost of the Red Mesa. He wasn't just an outlaw. He was a dark legend whispered by firesides, a boogeyman the lawmen used to scare rookie deputies. He was tall, broader than two normal men at the shoulder, and wore a long, dusty coat that seemed to carry the grit of a 1,000-mile ride. He was feared not just for his gun, but for his silence. Men twice his size had backed down from the sheer, unnerving stillness of his gaze. Whispers finally broke the paralysis. "It's him. Lord have mercy." Silas ignored them. He ignored the curtain twitching in the banker's office window. He ignored the men by the saloon who slowly backed away, their hands raised slightly to show they were no threat. His eyes, set deep under the brim of his hat, were locked only on Elara. They were the color of a winter sky, and they held no judgment at all. His voice was low and rough, like stones grinding together. It was meant for her, and her alone, yet it carried across the entire street. "You're coming with me." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Elara shrank back, the last bit of fight draining from her. Her voice was a barely audible whisper lost in the dust. "No, please, I have nothing." Silas didn't ask again. He closed the distance in 2 long strides. Before Elara could even raise her hands, before the town could even gasp, his arm snaked around her waist. It was a grip of iron. In one swift, shockingly fluid movement, he grabbed her and dragged her off her feet, pulling her up and sideways onto the saddle of his massive black horse as if she weighed nothing. She landed hard against him, the air forced from her lungs in a choked cry. The town was stunned into absolute silence. This was worse than shunning. This was abduction. This was a violation of every law, happening in broad daylight. In the name of the law, Judge Thorne had reappeared on the courthouse steps, his face a blotchy, apoplectic red. He pointed a shaking finger, the same one that had condemned Elara. "Let her go, Silas. You cannot just take... She is under the protection of..." He sputtered, his authority vanishing like smoke. Silas, with Elara held tight against his chest, slowly turned his horse to face the judge. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't speak. He just looked at him. It was a look of cold, primal contempt. It was the look of a wolf staring at a yapping dog. But it was more than that. It wasn't a look of malice, aimed at a stranger. It was a look of recognition, a dark, knowing stare, as if the judge, in his fine suit, was the real criminal in the street. Silas held that gaze for 1, 2, 3 seconds. The judge faltered, his hand dropping to his side. Without another word, Silas kicked his horse. The animal lunged forward, not back down the trail she had come, but straight through the center of town. He kicked again, and the horse broke into a hard gallop. They vanished past the last building, disappearing into the shimmering heat of the Badlands, leaving the town of Salvation Creek choking on a cloud of dust and disbelief. Elara was gone. The world dissolved into a blur of red rock and choking, alkali dust. Act 2 had begun, not with a whisper, but with the thunder of hooves. Elara was held against Silas with a grip that felt less like a man's arm and more like a steel band. Every jarring slam of the horse's hooves sent a shock of pain through her, driving the breath from her lungs. This wasn't a ride, it was a brutal possession, fast and terrifying. Her hair had been torn from its pins, whipping across her face, stinging her eyes and tasting of dust. She was convinced she was being taken for ransom, but the thought died as soon as it formed. She had nothing. She was nothing. The judge had made that clear. A more terrible thought, one that had been hiding in the back of her mind, now screamed for attention. He was taking her to a place where no one would hear her, a place where no one would even look. He was taking her deep into the canyons, a place the law wouldn't follow, to dispose of the unfit woman nobody in Salvation Creek would ever search for. They left the open trail and plunged into a maze of high-walled gullies, the horse scrambling up loose shale and dropping into dry arroyos, never slowing. He rode with a reckless precision, knowing this land as if he'd been born in it. Elara's knuckles were white, clutching the thick leather horn of the saddle, the only stability she had in a world that had been ripped from its axis. Just as she felt she would be torn apart by the pace, he pulled the horse to a sudden, sliding halt. The animal, breathing hard, lowered its head to drink from a small, hidden spring that seeped from a dark crack in the towering canyon wall. The silence was absolute. It was a vacuum broken only by the sound of the horse lapping water and Elara's own ragged, sobbing breaths. He didn't release her. He just sat there, the iron band of his arm still locked around her waist. The terror, sharpened to a razor's edge by the ride, now boiled over into a desperate last-stand fury. She didn't care if he was an outlaw. She didn't care about the judge or the bank or the ranch. She only cared about this final, terrible moment. She twisted in his grip, forcing herself to look at his face for the first time. It was a hard face, carved from the same red rock that surrounded them. She put every last ounce of her broken spirit into her voice. "Are you going to kill me?" He didn't react. She pushed harder, her voice raw and breaking. "Is that it? Was I so unfit you had to Finish the job? Silas finally turned his head. His eyes met hers. Elara had expected cruelty, or the cold emptiness of a killer, or that primal contempt he'd shown the judge. She saw none of it. His eyes weren't cruel. They were just tired, a bone-deep weariness that resonated with her own. He had the look of a man who, like her, had been judged by a world that didn't understand his code. A man who had been called Outlaw by the same kind of men who had just called her Unfit. He released his grip. The sudden freedom made her stumble as she slid from the horse, her legs collapsing under her. He swung down in one fluid motion, landing silently on the rock. "I knew your husband, Elara," he said. His voice was quiet, but it hit her harder than the ride. She froze, her hand at her throat. "What?" "David. We prospected together, up in the high country before." He gestured vaguely toward the world beyond the canyon. "Before I was this, and he was yours." This made no sense. Her husband was a good man, a simple man. He wouldn't know an outlaw. "You're lying." "He was a good man," Silas said, ignoring her accusation as he went to the spring, cupping water in his hand. "A trusting man. Too trusting." He drank, then looked at her, his gaze pinning her. "Which is why I took you. You had to be clear of that town." "Clear? I was humiliated. I lost everything." "You were being robbed," Silas cut in, his voice hardening, losing its weariness. He took a step closer. "You need to understand, ma'am. A judge, he didn't just rule against you." He leaned in, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper that seemed to shake the very rocks around them. "He arranged it." "Arranged it?" Elara's voice was hollow. The words didn't fit. That was a ruling. It was the law." "It was a theft, ma'am," Silas stated, his voice flat, devoid of pity, dealing only in facts. "David wasn't just prospecting. He found it. A rich vein of silver right under that worthless patch of yucca. On your west acre. Enough to make a man a king." Elara's mind flashed back to the last month. David's excitement, his long rides, the way he'd smiled and told her to just trust him. "He needed money for equipment," Silas continued, his gaze fixed on the canyon wall as if reading the story from the stone. "And like a fool, he went to the bank. He went to Croft. He told him everything, in confidence, seeking a partner. Alone. A cold dread, far deeper than the judge's humiliation, began to seep into Elara's bones. Croft didn't have that kind of money, Silas said. But Judge Thorne did. And Thorne saw a cleaner way than a partnership. A few sticks of dynamite in that old prospect shaft David was checking. A tragic accident. A mine collapse. Elara stopped breathing. "No, they said the timbers were rotten." "The timbers were fine," Silas said, finally looking at her. "I checked them myself. A week after. It was murder, plain and simple. They killed him for what was under his land." Suddenly the courtroom scene replayed in her mind, but this time in a horrifying, stark clarity. The outstanding mortgage, Croft's cold, patient smile, the judge's theatrical false pity. It all clicked into place. The unfit ruling wasn't a judgment. It was the final legal move in their chess game. They murdered her husband for the silver, and now they were using the law to seize the land it was buried under. Her grief, her poverty, her isolation, they weren't reasons for the ruling. They were tools. The humiliation that had burned her face just an hour ago was extinguished, doused by a flood of something new. It was a cold, hard, clarifying rage. A rage that burned away the tears, that steadied her trembling hands, that solidified her spine into steel. She wasn't judged. She was targeted. It was the breaking point, the moment a victim realizes their pain was not just fate, but a weapon used against them. Her world had been built on a lie, but now the truth was her only weapon. If you felt her pain, ride with us in true Western stories where every tale finds its voice. Elara slowly got to her feet, the dust falling from her dress. Her eyes were no longer haunted. They were the color of cold iron. "They have to pay," she said. Back in Salvation Creek, Judge Thorne stood on the courthouse steps, his face purple with fury and a new, creeping fear. He was shouting at the confused townsfolk. "The outlaw Silas has kidnapped her. That unstable woman taken. We'll form a posse. We ride for justice." Mr. Croft, standing beside him, checked the bullets in his revolver. They weren't riding for justice. They were riding to silence the only two people who knew the truth. The tension in the Badlands escalated with every passing hour. Miles behind them, the posse crashed through the canyons. They were clumsy, loud, a disorganized rabble of townsfolk and hired hands who knew more about branding cattle than tracking a man. They were driven by Judge Thorne's lies, yelling to one another across the gullies, their voices echoing like amateur dramatics. They kicked up a plume of dust that could be seen for miles, a dirty banner of misplaced justice. Mr. Croft was at their head, his face slick with sweat, his eyes darting nervously. He wasn't a leader. He was a man trying to plug a hole in a dam that was about to burst. They followed the obvious wide tracks Silas had left for them, convinced they were chasing a desperate, fleeing kidnapper. They reckoned they were the hunters. But Silas and Elara weren't running. They were moving with purpose. They were high above the canyon floor, on a narrow ridge that overlooked the main pass. Silas moved with the silent economy of a predator, and Elara, galvanized by the cold, hard truth, followed him without complaint. The desert, which had seemed so empty and terrifying, now felt like an ally. He had taught her to see the landscape as he did. The high rocks offered a vantage point. The dense mesquite offered cover. The sun itself was a weapon, blinding those who looked up from the canyon floor. He stopped and pulled a heavy revolver from his saddlebag. He offered it to her. "Grip first. You'll need this." She looked at the weapon and then at her own hands, which were scraped and raw. I don't know how." His instruction was brief, devoid of emotion. He showed her how the cylinder clicked open, how the cartridges slid into their chambers. He made her hold it, feel its weight, pointed at a distant dead yucca. "It ain't like in the stories," he said, his voice like gravel. "It kicks. You hold it steady. You pull the trigger, you don't jerk it. You don't aim to scare. You aim to stop." She looked at him, the outlaw, giving her a gun to fight the law. "They're good people, Silas. The posse. They're just mistaken." He let out a short, harsh breath that might have been a laugh in another man. "Folks in town, they ain't civilized, Elara," he said, his gaze fixed on the dust cloud of their pursuers. "They're just tame." The words resonated deep in her soul. That was it. Thorne, Croft, a silent town. They weren't moral. They were just domesticated, afraid to bite the hand that fed them, even if that hand was dirty. This outlaw, this ghost, possessed a harder, truer code. He wasn't tame. He was free. She held the cold steel of the revolver, the checkered grip fitting into her palm. And for the first time since her husband died, she didn't feel unfit. She felt fury. It was a clean, sharp, righteous fire. She wasn't a victim. She was an executioner. Silas pointed down to the narrow, rock-strewn pass below them. "They're coming." Croft is leading them. The judge was too yellow. Elara looked at him, her knuckles white on the gun. They're coming for the silver. Silas shook his head, his eyes cold as winter. They're coming to finish the job. The posse rode into Devil's Pass just as the sun began to dip, casting long, menacing shadows that stretched like claws across the canyon floor. The high, narrow walls amplified the sound of their horses' hooves, turning the clumsy clatter into a sound like approaching thunder. Mr. Croft was at the front, his face a mask of false bravado, his eyes darting left and right. He held his rifle across his saddle, a prop to make him look the part of a rescuer. The rest of the men, ranchers and farmhands, followed him, their expressions a mix of duty and unease. They were here to save a helpless widow from a notorious outlaw. A crack of gunfire exploded from the rocks above them. The shot wasn't aimed at them. It was aimed in front of them. A bullet ricocheted off a boulder just feet from Croft's horse, sending stone chips flying. The entire posse pulled up in a chaotic halt, horses rearing and whinnying, the men cursing. "He's up there," one yelled, pointing. "Hold your fire," Croft shouted, his voice cracking with a fear he tried to pass off as authority. He stared into the shadows of the high ridge. "Silas, give us the woman. Give us Elara and we'll see the law goes easy on you." "He's lying, ma'am," Silas's low voice rumbled beside Elara. "He's got no intention of letting either of us walk out of this pass." "I know," Elara said. Her voice was steady. She handed him the revolver he had given her. "Cover him, but don't shoot unless you have to. The others need to hear it from me." Before Silas could object, she stepped out from behind the cover of the boulders and onto the open ledge. She was no longer the trembling, humiliated victim from the courthouse. Her dress was torn and caked with red dust. Her hair was a wild tangle, but she stood tall, her chin up, her eyes blazing with a cold fire that the men below had never seen. She was transformed. "Elara, Mrs. Gable," one of the ranchers called out, relieved. "Are you all right? We've come to get you." Croft's face tightened. "Stay back, men. He's probably got a gun on her." "He didn't take me, Mr. Croft," Elara's voice rang out, clear and sharp, cutting through the canyon air. It was a voice they didn't recognize. "I'm not his prisoner." The posse stopped, their confusion palpable. This wasn't the script they'd been given. "I came with him," Elara continued, her gaze locking on the banker. "I came to find the man who murdered my husband." A wave of murmurs and uneasy shuffling passed through the men below. They looked at each other, then at Croft, then back at Elara. Croft's sweaty hand went to the pistol holstered on his hip. He unbuttoned the flap, but his eyes weren't on the rocks where Silas was hidden. They were fixed on her. He didn't see a widow. He saw a witness. He saw the end of his world. She's delirious," Croft yelled, trying to regain control. "The shock. Silas has twisted her mind. She's unfit. The judge said it himself." "He said it," Elara called back, "because he and you murdered David for the silver on our land." The posse froze. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and terrible. "That's a lie," Croft shrieked. "Is it?" Elara said, taking a step closer to the ledge, her voice dripping with newfound outlaw grit. "Because before he died, my husband wrote a confession. He signed a statement, Mr. Croft. He detailed your entire plan, the silver, the loan you proposed, the partnership with Judge Thorne. He drew a map." Croft's face went white. This was a lie. A desperate, brilliant bluff, but he didn't know that. "I know he did," Elara pressed on, "because he sent it to the U.S. Marshal in the next county. He told me if anything accidental happened to him, the Marshal was to open it. I reckon they're riding for Salvation Creek right now." That was the breaking point. The bluff had worked. Croft, trapped between the posse, who now suspected him, and the marshal he believed was coming, panicked. His entire future was being undone by the unfit woman above him. He ripped his pistol from its holster, but he didn't aim at Silas. He aimed it straight at Elara. "You lying!" Before he could fire, a black shape launched from the rocks above and to the side. Silas had circled around. He tackled Croft from his horse, and the two men crashed to the ground in a desperate, violent tangle of limbs and dust. The posse, realizing they'd been duped, just watched, their loyalties shattered, unsure who to follow, who to believe. A shot exploded through the canyon. Act 3 began not with a gavel, but a gunshot. The sound echoed, flat and final, off the canyon walls. The shot had come from Croft's gun, fired wildly as Silas tackled him. It spent its force harmlessly, chipping granite 3 feet to Elara's left. Before the banker could fire again, Silas smashed his fist into Croft's wrist, a sickening crack, and the gun fell to the dust. Croft screamed, clutching his broken hand, his fight dissolving into pathetic sobs. Silas rose, his chest heaving, his face a mask of cold contempt. He kicked the pistol away. The posse just sat on their horses, staring. The men who had ridden out to save a victim were now looking at the true villain, whimpering in the dirt. Their leader was a murderer. They had been used. One rancher, his face dark with shame, slowly dismounted. He pulled a rope from his saddle. "He ain't just a liar," the rancher said, and his voice thick with disgust as he looked at his fellow townsfolk. "He's a killer, and we almost did his dirty work for him." He yanked Croft to his feet. They tied the banker's hands and slung him over his own horse like a sack of feed. Leaderless, ashamed, and realizing they had been fools, the posse turned their horses back towards Salvation Creek. They had a new prisoner. Elara and Silas followed. They didn't join the group. They rode 10 paces behind, a silent, imposing rear guard. They were no longer the hunted. They were the arbiters of a justice that had failed. They rode back into town under a sky that had turned a sickly, bruised purple. The air was heavy, still, and charged with an electric tension, as if the heavens themselves were holding their breath, waiting for the final, bloody showdown. A storm was brewing, a perfect mirror for the one about to break over Salvation Creek. Word spread faster than their horses' hooves as the grim procession moved down the main street. Doors opened. Faces appeared in windows. The townsfolk gathered, sensing this was no rescue. This was a reckoning. They saw Croft, tied and broken, and they saw Elara riding tall beside the outlaw, her face set like stone. The posse stopped at the jailhouse. Elara and Silas did not. They kept walking, their horses moving straight toward the saloon. Elara slid from the saddle before Silas could even dismount. She landed on the dusty street, her boots planting with a solid, determined sound. She was covered in the red dust of the Badlands, which looked like dried blood in the strange, stormy light. This was the walk they all wished they could make, back to the place of their deepest shame. But this time, standing tall, she walked past the mercantile, past the bakers, her gaze straight ahead. The townsfolk who had shunned her now parted, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and a new, startling respect. She reached the bat-wing doors of the saloon and didn't hesitate. She pushed them open. The tinny piano music died instantly. The laughter choked, every eye snapped to the door. There he was, Judge Thorne, sitting at a back table, a half-empty bottle of whiskey and a glass in his hand, trying to drink away the fear that had kept him from joining the posse. He saw her. He saw the dust, the fury in her eyes, and the shadow of the outlaw filling the doorway behind her. The judge's face turned a pasty, ghastly white. His hand trembled. The whiskey glass slipped from his fingers and shattered on the floor. "You," he whispered, his voice barely a croak. Elara's voice was cold steel, cutting through the silence. "The hearing is back in session, Judge." The saloon was a tomb. The only sound was the drip, drip, drip of whiskey from the table where Judge Thorne's glass had shattered. He tried to regain his footing, to puff up his chest with the authority that had served him his entire life. This is an outrage," he sputtered, his eyes darting to the faces in the room. You are mad, woman, delirious." "I was delirious," Elara's voice cut back, sharp and clean, not a trace of the victim left. "In your courtroom, I was delirious with grief, but the desert has a way of burning the fog out of a person's head." She took a step toward him. Silas remained at the door, a dark silhouette against the brewing storm, his arms crossed. His presence was a silent promise, a guarantee that this time the hearing would be fair. The townsfolk, led by the shamed Posse members, began to file in through the bat-wing doors. They didn't go to the bar. They didn't sit at the tables. They formed a tight, silent circle around Elara and the judge. This was their courtroom now. They were the jury. "You wanted my land, Judge," Elara said, her voice carrying to every corner of the room. "But you didn't want it for the mortgage. You wanted it for the silver." A collective gasp sucked the air from the saloon. "My husband found a vein," she continued, her outlaw grit showing. "He was a good man, but a trusting one. He trusted Mr. Croft. He told him everything, looking for a loan." "Lies!" Thorne roared, finding a sudden burst of bluster. He slammed his fist on the table. "This is slander. I am the law in this town. You will all stand down. This woman is unstable. She was abducted by—" "She wasn't abducted," the lead rancher from the Posse said, his voice hard as iron. His words hit Thorne like a punch. "And she ain't lying." As if on cue, two Posse members shoved Mr. Croft through the doors. The banker stumbled and fell, landing in the sawdust and filth, clutching his broken hand to his chest. He looked up, his eyes wide with animal terror, seeing Thorne. "Tell them, Croft," Elara commanded, her voice dropping. "Tell them how you and the judge paid to have my husband's mind collapse. Tell them how you forged the final mortgage papers to make sure I'd default. Tell them how unfit was just a word to cover a murder." Croft looked at Thorne, his face a mask of pathetic pleading. "Judge, tell them we didn't. It wasn't." "Silence, you fool," Thorne hissed, his control cracking, his mask of civility melting. "This woman is—" But seeing Thorne ready to sacrifice him, the banker broke. A raw, high-pitched wail tore from his throat. "It was him!" he screamed, pointing a trembling, unbroken finger at the judge. "It was all his idea, the dynamite, the ruling. He said it was clean. He said no one would ever listen to her. He promised me half." The crowd surged, a low animal growl rising from their throats. "See?" Thorne bellowed, backing against the bar, his hands raised. "The ravings of a desperate man. Who are you to believe, folks? Me? Your judge who has served you for 20 years? Or a broken banker and a tainted woman?" The room fell silent again, the accusation hanging. And then a new sound. Thump. The saloon's barman, a quiet man named Jed, who had never spoken a word to Elara in her life, slammed a heavy, leather-bound ledger onto the bar. His voice was quiet, but it was deadly. "The judge. He paid off the two prospectors who found her husband's body, paid them $500 in gold coin." Thorne's blood ran cold. That's a lie. A bookkeeping error." "Is it?" Jed said, tapping the book. He paid them from the town's account, then covered it as surveyor fees. And I heard him, right here at this bar, drunk on the judge's whiskey, bragging about how easy the work was. That was the final nail. The tame town broke. The spell of authority was shattered. The ranchers, the bakers, the blacksmiths, they turned on Thorne. The moral closure was swift and brutal. They didn't lay a hand on him, but their collective judgment, their sudden, focused contempt, stripped him bare. His face crumpled. His power, the only thing he had, evaporated. He was humiliated, undone, stripped of his title by the very people he had controlled. In that moment, Elara's redemption was complete. Her name was cleared. The ranch was hers. The unfit woman was the only one in the room with any honor. Silas watched from the door, a silent guardian. He hadn't drawn his gun. He hadn't needed to. The real law, the hard moral code of the people, had finally been served. The judge, utterly broken, a hollow shell, looked for an escape. He saw the back door, a path to the alley. He made a desperate, scrambling run for it. Silas didn't move. He just watched. It was Elara who stepped into his path, blocking the door. Her voice was quiet, final. "Ain't no way, Judge." The dawn broke clean, washing the purple bruises from the sky. The storm had passed, leaving the air sharp and new. In Salvation Creek, Judge Thorne sat in his own cold jail cell, a hollow-eyed man awaiting the U.S. Marshal, miles away. At her ranch, Elara stood on the porch. The mortgage papers, torn in half by the townsfolk, lay on the railing. In her hand, she held the small carved wooden bird. Its edges no longer felt sharp. She saw him by the gate, his horse ready for a long ride. Silas. He wasn't looking at the ranch. He was looking at her. They shared a look, not of romance or debt, but of deep, unspoken respect. He was the cowboy grit she needed to find her own. He tipped his hat, a small, formal gesture. "Reckon you're fit to handle the rest, ma'am." Elara looked down at the wooden bird, then back at him, a small, strong smile, touching her lips for the first time in a year. "I reckon I am." Silas nodded once. He turned his horse, not looking back, and rode east, a dark silhouette against the fiery sunrise. He was an outlaw who had delivered a justice the law never could. Elara watched him go, feeling the warmth of the new sun on her face. She was finally at peace. The scars remained, but they were now a map of her strength. The unfit label was just dust, blown away by the coming dawn. This was one of many true Western stories. If it stirred your heart, saddle up with us for the next ride.